Hey there, my name is Jim Edgar. I've been messing around with an interesting audio interface for the past couple of weeks, and I wanted to share what I found and how it might be helpful in your VO studio. The interface is the Presonus Revelator io24. Now, on the surface, it's just a simple two-input interface which connects to your computer via USB, but there's some interesting things going on under the hood, and that's what I want to focus on here. Before I do that, I want to give a quick tip of the mouse to two people. The first is Joe Gilder of HomeStudioCorner.com, and the second is George Whittam of GeorgeThe.tech. Joe had actually been talking about these features while demonstrating the Presonus Revelator USB microphone, but George was the first one to bring to my attention that they had actually taken some of these features out and placed them inside of a USB interface, which has a couple of XLR mic inputs, which means you can use these tools with any XLR connected microphone. Now, the basic interface itself is a simple two-input interface. It's got two combi jacks on the left-hand side, and it's got all of the controls on the right-hand side. The basic unit itself is aluminum, which is fairly rugged. It does have a plastic face to it, so I don't know how well it's going to take impact, but I also don't know how often you're going to be carrying it around with you on the road. It has a fairly simple and somewhat fiddly interface. And by that I mean what it has done nicely is lifted this little display, which seems to have come out of the Presonus series of live mixers, and added it in there so you know what you're doing. And then a lot of the controls are a combination of button pushes and then one dial for entry. So at the main screen, for example, I can change the headphone output. I can go ahead and change to the regular monitors if I had speakers attached to that. And I can just toggle through those things to make those changes. If I push on one of the channels, I get the ability to set the gain. And again, I push the button. It takes me to the phantom power setting, which I'm going to turn on. It also has a high pass filter, which I can turn on. This high pass filter is an 80 hertz high pass, which lives inside the hardware here, which is different from any software I'm going to talk about in a second. As you can see, it sort of reverts out of that if I don't do anything for a couple of seconds, but it does indicate now that the 48 volt phantom power is on and that we're working with, in this case, no presets. That's the other button we can press, which we'll get to in a sec. But what I can do is choose the first preset, choose the second preset, or hold until I choose no presets. And the details of that we'll talk about once we talk about the software that we can run this all through. But in this case, the only other kind of annoying thing about it is that it does say it's a USB-C device. They do ship it with a USB-C to USB 2.0 cord. So if you want to go directly to a USB-C connector on your computer, you will need to get an extra cord. Audio jacks are in the back of this, so the monitor will go out to the rear, as do the headphones. So I suddenly seem to have a little more hardware around my head, which I apologize for, but since I'm going to be demonstrating some things through the Revelator, I actually need to get some signal into the video while I'm shooting it, so I'm running that through my other interface. Anyway, the interface gets a little bit more interesting when you start using the Universal Control software that you download after you've registered your device. This is kind of the top level of it. It is a firmware-based system, so hopefully there will be continuing updates with this from Presonus. But it lets us set the sample rate. In this case, I'm using 48K, but you could run up to 96. It also has a device mode, which in this case today we're going to run in single. When you go to multi-mode on Mac OS, it enables you to do some loopback functions and some more sophisticated mixing things, which is a little outside of what I want to focus on today. When you have your device connected via USB, it shows up here in the bottom, and by clicking directly on that, we get our basic interface and settings. We have the two channels that we looked at a moment ago. Channel 1 is mic input 1, channel 2 is mic input 2. There are three other mixer channels and a reverb channel, which we're going to kind of ignore a little bit today because we just want to look at it in terms of the basic VO features, so using it in your home VO studio. What it also has, remember I talked earlier about these two presets. And the preset in this case is a broadcast preset, or if I click the bottom one is a vocal preset, or if I click that one more time, it turns it off. At this point, I'm still talking to you through the other interface because we don't have any phantom power or gain going to this microphone that I have attached to the Revelator. So the first thing we're going to do is turn on the phantom power, which we can do right here in software, which actually turns it on the device. We are controlling the hardware device through this software interface. The other thing that we can now start doing is adding some gain to the other mic. So what probably will happen as I start adding a little bit of gain is that very annoyingly you're going to start hearing a couple of me. So if I get up, I don't know, around 30 dB, that's probably a decent level, but I'm going to get rid of this one. So let me get this out of the way. So now I should just be talking to you through mic channel 1 with 30 dB of gain on the Revelator interface. Now, you are hearing me through the broadcast preset, which is one of the presets that Presonus gives us. In this case, it uses several aspects of the fat channel channel strip that is in software. It uses a high-pass filter, a gate, a compressor, some EQ, and a limiter. So that is why my voice probably sounds a little more processed. I could go through, for example, and turn these off right on the broadcast setting without changing anything else, and that should dramatically affect whether or not I have a raw signal coming in. In this case, you'll notice that as I added these back on, you do see, in addition to the level coming through, a processing indicator, which is that blue bar that when I stop talking, the expander, which is really a gate, starts engaging itself and quieting down the background sounds in my area. So one thing I think we can agree is that using the broadcast preset in this particular recording space is probably not optimal. So I'm just going to turn that off real quick so we'll get back to just my voice coming to you. But where this starts to get a little more interesting is where we start to dig into some of the ability to save and recall a lot of this information. So the first thing I'm going to do is maybe work the mic just a hair closer so it's not opening and closing that gate quite so annoyingly. There we go. Anyway, so I've got this little icon right here, which looks like a little save icon, will actually enable me to find some local presets. In this case, I've already saved up a couple. One of them actually has no effects whatsoever on it. So I'm going to load that in to this first preset right here. And then when I'm out here, what happens is by moving this dial, I now have no FX on this first preset. Now that's kind of nice because it gives me just a simple dry input chain, which is really the way we're probably going to run our Voiceover Studio most of the time. Once I go back in there, I can start loading these other presets in. I, for example, have one that just has a 75 hertz high pass filter. So I'm going to load that into this second empty device preset. I've got one here that has both a 75 high pass filter and a de-esser engaged. So I'm going to load that into this second preset here. And that means when I go back out to this surface, I can choose my vocal preset, move the dial around to the 75-foot high pass, and I have a 75 hertz high pass filter engaged on the second preset, which is what gets accessed when I switch between these two presets. So I've got a dry channel and I have a 75 hertz high pass filter. Now, what you can actually do is, since there's only 6 slots for user-defined presets, you can actually offload these things. So say, for example, I take this first preset, this no FX that I'm playing with, which is what we're set to, and I decide that I'm going to actually build on that. So I have my fat channel right here, which I'm going to click on and open up. I could, of course, just turn these things on and off. These are the individual kind of preset settings for each of it. I've got a limiter here that doesn't really affect me because my volume's coming in pretty reasonably. But if I want to go ahead and play a little bit with the fat channel, I can click on this icon right here. And this gives me direct access to the individual modules that are in this processing chain for this particular input channel. And again, this is all occurring before I'm recording, so we are modifying the input, which always makes me a little bit nervous. But say, for example, we have a high-pass filter. We can turn them on and off with these buttons right here. You'll notice when I turn that on, this is set at 73. I could bring that way, way high up and kind of change the timbre of my voice, or get it down where a high-pass filter should probably live for voiceover, somewhere 90 to 70, depending on where the pitch of your voice sits. I'm going to leave that on. I've got a gate, which we played with a little bit earlier. I've got a compressor, so when I click on that, you'll notice it brings it up here for me. If I turn that on, you'll see that the threshold is set fairly high, so it's not doing much. But if I start to bring that down into an area here, if I bump up the ratio, all of a sudden we've got that sort of overcompressed voice, which says, I have put processing on my input chain. We've got a nice little 4-node EQ with a high and low shelf, but I can actually adjust a low, low mid, high, mid, or high. I also have a little low shelf that I can play with right there, turn that on and off, and I get full adjustment on that. And then of course a limiter, which in this case is set at minus 1.5. So if I were going to get loud, which I'm not, nothing would go past that minus 1.5 dB. So yes, I hear those of you who do video games getting very excited all of a sudden. This last thing is a voice effect, which works kind of on a hotkey. We can turn it on or off on one or the other of the channel. It's kind of more geared for playing around or doing sort of vocal effects for podcasts or broadcasts or things like that. It's probably not the sort of thing you're going to do on the front end of your recording in your studio. So we're going to bypass that for right now. If I do hit the space over here, you can hear that it's doing space over the thing. All right, we got that out of our system. Okay, so in this case, I have adjusted and created a new effect in my fat channel that has a high-pass filter on. I'm going to go ahead and just engage that limiter to protect myself. So now I've made a change with a high-pass filter and a 1.5 limiter. So what I could do at this point is actually save that preset. I can store it right here to this empty preset, and we'll just call that 79 high-pass. And, 790, I can type. There we go. And limiter of 1.5. And when I store that, it stores it right here to this fourth setting. Now, if I go back here, I've got that new preset that I've made. I can actually store this out to my computer. So when it says local presets, that's actually where it lives. If I right click on this one out here, which was the one we just created, you'll see that it lets me show it in the Finder. And what we find is that Presonus very kindly puts this in a very accessible folder that is in your documents folder, that is on Presonus, in the Revelator IO, in the Fat Channel folder right here. And by going here, we can rename things if we don't get it quite right. But all of these things that are .channel are presets using the Fat Channel processing. So the other interesting thing that we can do is control the scene, which is a different variable, and it covers us for other setup things. What you may have noticed is that if I'm, for example, having to turn on the 48-volt power every time and bring my gain up, that means I've got to either use the front end of the device or I do it in software each time. However, up here in the upper right, we've got this little kind of multi-square thing, which stands for the scenes. What you'll notice is that I have locked down a lot of my settings and saved them into several helpful scenes, depending on what I want to do. One thing that might be fairly helpful is this idea of being able to trigger different gains. A lot of times I get voice actors who want to have their interface in the booth with them because they want to, when they have a more dynamic performance perhaps, change their input gain between the character who's yelling loudly and the character who's whispering. Well, I can actually set up a scene that does that. So for example, if I have mic 1 at 35 dB, let's just bring that up here, and I hit that scene, I recall it. I'm going to be a little bit louder when I start talking in a second. So now what's happened is I've got about 5 more dB of gain on the input, and I have this running through my 75-put high-pass preset, which I have loaded in with this scene. So the scenes actually will load in the device presets that you have stored. It will also store everything on the different channels that you have. And so it's a quick way, for example, for me to go from 35 dB of input gain to, say, 20 dB of input gain if I'm going to talk a lot more loudly and I don't want to blow out my mic. So this actually gives me software control of my input device without having to step out of the booth and go find my interface. Now, actually, this type of interface control exists through the universal control software. So there are some other Presonus interfaces that will let you do this. And it is a nice way of kind of setting up a studio so you're not jumping back and forth or you're not trying to ride the gain. You just have specific presets so that you can get right back where you needed to be, depending on how loud your performance is going to be. So just to wrap things up a little bit, how helpful is this going to be for our voiceover work? One of the things that I think it does nicely is it gives us immediate access to input gain changes. And unlike a lot of the more tactile type of interfaces, it does give us a specific value for the dB gain. So we might know, for example, that our loud invested video game characters are going to be a -20, where our regular voice is going to be maybe -28 or -34, but it gives us a hard number to return to rather than sort of figuring, are we going to be at 10 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 1:15 on a marked knob on the front of a unit. So it does give us a nice ability to get back to where we want to work. It does give us some nice presets, and if we use those judiciously in our input recording, we can control things a little bit better. It's pretty safe to use a high-pass filter. When we start playing with de-essers or any kind of EQ, we really do need to know what we're doing because we are baking that into our recordings. There's not a way to bypass that. However, I do like the ability to control the interface input levels directly from the software. So if you've got controls inside your booth and can access the universal control software screen, you can actually go ahead and switch between input settings on the fly during a session, which might be helpful for you. I do think that we always want to use input processing judiciously, so I would just warn you about that in advance. The scenes are also really pretty nice, and the fact that you can offload all this stuff directly to your computer means that you could have someone like me or someone who's going to work with your sound to develop a specific EQ setting, some useful limiting settings for your sessions, which will then give you those presets without a lot of digging under the hood in order to make that happen. You can basically store an unlimited number of presets and load those into your computer for various situations and sessions. Other than that, the only other thing I wanted to show you before I wrap up today is one of the things I don't like is to pull a microphone out of the XLR cable while it's hot. So I'm always turning off the phantom power before I do that. Now, what's nice is I went ahead and set up a scene where when I press this button that says all off and recall it, it's actually going to drop my gain down, turn off the 48 volt phantom power so that I can unplug my mic and get on to the next things I'm going to do today. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please email me or contact me through my website, which is JustAskJimVO.studio. And as I always like to say, go be brilliant. Take care.